Hi, Year 9. We are going to continue our lesson today with 1C, which is decimal places and significant figures. So last class we talked all about integers. So now what happens when we actually get a number that has a decimal in it? There are a lot of options for things we can do, so we need to understand very clearly what we do with our decimals. We also talked about setting up our paper and our notes correctly. So take a moment now, if you don't already have your title written down and your date, and draw your line down your paper so that we can continue with proper setup notes. Okay, so don't hesitate to pause and then we'll start again. First word is critical digits that we really need to be familiar with. And anytime that you're asked to do something with a decimal, you're going to have to look for a critical digit if you're supposed to round. You guys are asked to round a lot. So we need to understand what that rounding really means. So a critical digit is the number that's to the right of the decimal place that you want to round to. So I have an example off to the right, 2.719. In this example, you're asked to round to the 10th place, which is right here. It's that 7. So that's my 10th. This is the place to round to. That means that I need to look to the right. That is my critical digit. And if that digit is a 0 to 4, then I'm going to keep my answer as 2.7. But if the number is 5 to 9, then I'm going to round the 7 up to an 8. So go ahead and take a look at my example. What do you guys think I'm going to have to do here? Okay, critical digit is a 1. So if that 1 is a 0 to 4, then I keep my answer as just 2.7, because again, that 7 is where I'm rounding to, so I don't want any more digits except for the 10th position. But if it's a 5 to 9, I'm going to round up. So for this one, since it's a 1, I stay, okay, and my answer would wind up being 2.7. Since it's not an exact answer, though, we use these symbols, okay? Either the 2 squiggly lines or an equal sign with 2 dots on the top and the bottom. So we can say that 2.719 is not exactly 2.7, but we rounded it to 2.7. So that is actually an approximated answer. So I'm going to use those symbols when I'm approximating. So anytime you're asked to round, I'm approximating. So now let's try a couple others. Round to 2 decimal places, which is the 100th position for these last 2 down here, okay? So again, I want to round to where this 7 is positioned. So I'm going to have to look to my critical value. I'll call that C for critical value, okay? My critical value is in the 5 to 9 category, which means, boom, I'm going to have to move that 7 up. So I'm going to have 2, 5, 6, 256, and 18 hundredths. So 256.18 means 256 and 18 hundredths. In the second example, here is the 4 in the 100th position. And that, again, that's my decimal place that I want to round to because I want 2 decimal places, which means 2 positions after the decimal. So I'm going to have to look to my critical digit, which is a 5. That means that it is going to take us up again. So I'm going to have 0.0, and my 4 is going to have to move up to a 5. Okay? So again, both times I had to round up. Just depends on what that critical value is. So in this scenario, I have 5 hundredths. I have no whole numbers, and I have 5 hundredths, and that is 0.05. Sometimes in directions, it will not always tell you to round to 2 decimal places. It will tell you to round to a certain number of significant figures. And significant figures are those numbers that really are holding, basically they're telling you exactly what numbers you need to pay attention to in the problem that you're working on, right? So they're all numbers that are non-zero numbers. So anything from 1 to 9 is considered significant. Then you have captive zeros. So think about what happens if you're in captivity, all right? These are these numbers down here, the ones that are stuck between all the non-zero numbers. Okay, those are captive zeros. And then you have trailing zeros, but trailing zeros are only counted as significant if the number has a decimal. So for example, if you look here, anything in red, or this brownish red color, is significant. So here we have captive zeros, and we also have numbers that are from 1 to 9. And you also wind up having this trailing zero. Trailing means it's at the end, right? Trailing means it's at the end. It's kind of like the tail, okay? So that one's important because it's trailing. But none of the numbers in front, none of the zeros in front are significant, and that's just because they're placeholders, okay? They're not telling you where this number is starting. They're not telling you where the number ends. They're just saying, hey, I'm going to hold this place because we're beginning at the 3, which is in the thousandths position, okay? So we're not going to count those as significant. If you look at the second example here, you have a captive zero. It's between the 9 and the 2. And then you have trailing zeros, but remember, they're only important if the number has a decimal in it. There's no decimal in this question, so we don't count those as significant, okay? So this question only has 4 significant digits, or figures. I'll use an F for figures, that would make more sense. Whereas the last question had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 significant figures, okay? So, and look at this last one, all right? We have a captive zero, we have a 9, a 2, a 4, and we have some trailing zeros. Those are trailing zeros, but remember, there is a decimal in the question, so are we going to count them? And the answer is yes, we are. So we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 significant figures in that second number, or third number, okay? So if your directions say round to 3 significant figures, we're just shortening SF so you guys don't have to write significant figures all the time. So if I want to round to 3 significant figures, I'm looking at, well, this is a number. Remember, all non-zeros are significant. So I want to count 2, 5, and 3. I only want those 3 significant figures though. And you always start from the left to move to the right. So that means this 9 is the number that's in question. So if I'm going to round appropriately, I have to make sure I use that 9 as my critical digit, and I check to see if I need to round up the 3 or keep the 3 where it is. So since it's a 9, I'm going to round up 2.54, right? Pause here and see if you guys can try these on your own. See if you can identify where that third significant figure is and what number you would use as the critical digit to round it, okay? So pause here and try this, and then see if you guys agree with me in the end. Did you guys get 5, 6, 9? Because that 8 is our critical, and it had to move this 8 up to a 9. Now then, what happens to all the rest of the numbers? Since I can only have 3 significant figures, the rest of the numbers turn into trailing zeros. So they are not counted as significant. So I still only have 3 significant figures here and 3 significant figures here. And hopefully you guys tried, maybe you already tried, 2 significant figures. So again, these 2 first zeros don't count. Those 2 zeros don't count. So I'm starting here at the 4, and then that's a captive zero, so that does count. So that means I need to look at this 5, because that would be the critical digit, because 4 and 0 right now are my 2 significant figures. So what is going to happen to that 0? And since it's a 5, it is going to round it up. So 0.041. So then what happens to the rest of my problem? The numbers are now zeros. So I still only have 2 significant digits. I actually can't put those zeros at the end because remember, they're counted as significant if there's a decimal. So if my question only wants 2 significant figures, I can only actually put 4 and 1. So no zeros after, okay? So that is 2 significant figures. It's good to think through those. And then last but not least, this one, you have a ton of numbers before the decimal and after the decimal. But again, I only want two significant figures. So if I start from the left to the right, I already have my 2 right there, okay? So I'm going to look, and I have that 0, and my 0 is going to be my critical digit. Will that 0 change the 3? No, it won't because it's too small, right? So it's below 5. So I'm going to say, okay, 2, 3, and then I need to still say that, we're dealing with 23,000, so I'm going to change those 2 zeros, okay? Those zeros are not significant because I do not have a decimal. So I still have 2 significant figures, okay? So just to consider when this really means, why would we even need this, okay? If you guys go off to be scientists one day, or if you guys go off to deal with anything where you have to conduct an experiment, you might be dealing with something that's super, super small. So for example here, in a scientific experiment, you were using very, very small amounts of magnesium, so 0.0025 grams, and a really small amount of potassium. Okay, so if I have these super, super small amounts, and then the directions say round to 2 decimal places instead of 2 significant figures, how would that look different? So I'm going to set up a little table here, okay? What would it look like if I rounded to 2 decimal places? And then what would it look like if I rounded to 2 significant figures? Okay? So 2 decimal places, that would mean just these first 2 numbers from the decimal. So that means I would have 0.0. I would look at the 2. The 2 would tell me to not do anything to the 0. So I would have 0 again. Then I would do the same thing in the second question. 0.0. And then I look at the 6. And that would round up to a 1. So it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of difference between those 2 numbers. Try now to find out what the 2 significant figures would look like, and see if you think it would be a little bit more accurate, okay? Or maybe not, maybe less accurate. So try those on your own, and we'll chat about them when I see you guys next class.